The morning sun had not yet climbed high above the Tower of London when the Queen walked out into the pale light of May. The air was still, though it seemed to carry the weight of centuries, as if every stone beneath her feet remembered the sorrow of those who had gone before. Around her, the silence of the crowd pressed close, broken only by the muffled beat of a single drum, summoning her forward to meet her fate. Welcome, dear traveler of time, to this telling of Anne Boleyn's life, a life woven with ambition, brilliance, love, and tragedy. As you listen, I invite you to pause for a moment and share where in the world you rest this night, for together we form a circle across time and place, a memory network of voices and dreams. Do not forget to join this channel of timeless history documents where stories like these live on, waiting to find you again. The soft rhythm of that drum fades now, yet let us not hasten past it. For in that measured beat lies the end of all her striving, all her laughter, all her defiance, and the last echo of a life that began many years before in gentler surroundings. To understand the scaffold where Anne stood, we must first step back, far away, into the dim corridors of childhood, into the fields of Kent, where her family's house, Hever Castle, lay hidden among meadows and streams. It is said that the air there was often heavy with the scent of hawthorn and damp earth, that the birds called in the morning from the hedgerows, and that the young Anne would walk the shaded gardens with a quick and watchful eye. One wonders what she saw then, when she was still untouched by destiny. Were her eyes turned to the roses, or to the flicker of a falcon overhead, or already to the shifting fortunes of men and women at court? Her family, the Boleyns, were not yet of ancient blood, but they were rising, as the tide of fortune sometimes carries new branches upward. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat, fluent in tongues, well-liked by kings and princes. Her mother, Lady Elizabeth Howard, carried the proud lineage of the Howards, and through her veins ran the pulse of old nobility. Between these two, Anne was shaped, one line newly ambitious, the other long established yet wary of change. Perhaps the child felt this tension as she walked the stone halls of Hever, the sense of belonging and yet of striving, of being both secure and vulnerable at once. There are no pages that tell us precisely what words were spoken to her in those early years. Did her father speak often of courts and crowns? Did her mother whisper of modesty and duty? Or was the young girl left to draw her own lessons from the quiet rituals of a noble household, where servants moved silently, fires crackled in the hearth, and prayers rose each night in the family chapel? We know only that she was clever, observant, with a mind quick to grasp the games that moved unseen beneath the surface of life. And already she must have learned that, in such a world, silence was as powerful as speech, a glance as sharp as a blade. In her play with her sister Mary and her brother George, perhaps she rehearsed the gestures of grace and wit that would one day turn a king's heart. Imagine her as a child in those gardens, her fingers brushing the damp stone of the castle walls, her gaze lingering on the glimmer of sunlight caught in a stream. The stillness of childhood is a fragile thing, and we know it would not last long for Anne. Soon her father would send her abroad, into courts more splendid and perilous than the quiet meadows of Kent. Yet the memory of Hever, of green fields and the hush of rural England would follow her always, a contrast to the golden halls and whispered intrigues that lay ahead. But before we journey with her across the sea, let us linger here in her youth. For what is childhood but the soil in which all future choices grow? The walls of Hever Castle may seem mute to us, but they sheltered a girl who would, in time, stand at the heart of a storm that shook England's throne. The tapestries that hung in her family's halls depicted scenes of knights, saints, and kings. Did she gaze upon them and imagine her own fate? Or did she see only a girl's reflection in the woven threads? There is something haunting in thinking of her then, for we know what she did not, that the years would carry her to triumph and to death. Yet perhaps she felt a shadow even then, as sensitive souls sometimes do. The cry of a bird at dusk, the sudden silence of the woods, the chill of the stone floor beneath her bare feet, small signs that life is never entirely safe. As she grew, her father prepared to place her where fortune might be won. Education was the gift given to her, rarer for women than for men, and hers was to be refined in the courts of Europe. But still, before the ships, before the dances, before the glittering company of queens, there was the girl of Hever, gazing at the world with dark eyes that seemed already older than her years. The door closes softly behind her as she leaves childhood. The sound lingers, as though we stand in the corridor long after she has gone. That single detail, the closing of a door, will open the next chapter of her life, carrying us from Kent into lands where her name would first be whispered as one destined to catch the notice of kings. The door had closed softly behind her, and with it the years of childhood were sealed within stone and memory, while before her stretched the uncertain path of youth that led beyond her country's borders. When she stepped away from Hever Castle, she was not only leaving a home but walking into a wider world, carried by the designs of her father, who believed that service abroad would polish his daughter into a jewel worthy of the most glittering courts. Thus it was that Anne, still little more than a girl, was placed into the household of Margaret of Austria in the Low Countries, a woman renowned for her wisdom and her patronage of learning. There, in the cool halls of Mechlin, she encountered not only new languages and manners, but the sight of books illuminated with gold, music drawn from strings and voices, unlike those of her Kentish fields, and the scent of foreign flowers brought into chambers where young ladies of noble birth were instructed in the arts of refinement. One can imagine Anne moving among them, her dark eyes attentive, her ears quick to catch every accent and gesture. Though her stay with Margaret was not long, it was long enough to open before her a horizon far beyond the hedgerows of England. She saw how power was exercised not by force alone, but by grace, by learning, by subtle play of words and glances. Was it here that she first understood that a woman, though bound by expectation, might still shape her fate if she possessed charm sharpened by wit? The question lingers, for history does not hand us her private thoughts, only traces of what she became. From the Netherlands she journeyed into France, and here the colors grew brighter, the perfume stronger, the court more dazzling. She entered the service of Queen Claude, consort of Francis I, and it was there, in that French court, alive with music and pageantry, that her spirit was burnished into something singular. Anne absorbed the language so fully that later her English would carry the cadence of a French tongue. She learned the graceful movements of dance, the elegance of dress, the art of speaking with restraint, yet filling the air with suggestion. She learned to read not only books but faces, to measure the meaning of a silence, to know when a smile concealed rivalry. The France of Francis was a place where humanist thought mingled with sensuality, where poets spoke of beauty as power, and painters captured the light of women's faces as though it might never fade. Anne moved within that circle, neither the most beautiful nor the most wealthy, but already compelling in ways that drew the eye. Her figure was slight, her features not the soft ideal of her age, yet there was something in her presence, some blend of confidence and mystery that marked her apart. It was said that she carried herself with such grace that none could forget her once they had seen her. At times, when she walked through the corridors where French tapestries hung heavy with images of hunting and feasting, perhaps she wondered whether she would ever return to her own land, or whether her future would be tied to foreign princes and ladies. Yet beyond all the finery of that world, she must also have felt the undercurrent of rivalry and danger that always accompanied a court. The air may have been filled with perfume and the sound of lutes, but beneath it was the quiet rustle of intrigue, the shifting favor of kings, the precariousness of women whose fortunes depended on the gaze of men. Did she sense already that one day she herself would walk upon such a knife's edge, that admiration could turn to envy and love to destruction? It was in these years that she absorbed the currents of reform that stirred across Europe. The talk of new learning, of scriptures translated into common tongues, of corruption in monasteries. These were whispers that she would carry back with her, later to intertwine with Henry's own break from Rome. Yet for now, she was still a young woman at court, learning the steps of dances, listening to the songs of poets, practicing her French so that each word fell like music from her lips. The courtiers around her may not have known that the girl who stood quietly among them would one day alter the fate of kingdoms. When at last the time came for her return to England, the ship waited at harbor, sails straining in the wind. Anne must have stood on the deck as France receded into the horizon, the shore dissolving into mist, her heart full of both loss and expectation. The laughter of her companions echoed faintly as the waves slapped against the hull, but perhaps Anne's gaze lingered on the vanishing coastline, as though she knew she was leaving behind more than a country. She was leaving behind a version of herself, one that would never return. What had begun as a journey of learning would now return her as a woman transformed, carrying the polish of Europe back into England's court, where every gesture, every word, would soon draw notice. The ship creaked as it cut through the waters, and the gulls cried overhead. The salt wind carried with it the promise of both triumph and sorrow, though Anne could not yet know which would outweigh the other. In her chest, the heart of a young woman beat quickly, for she was sailing not only to her homeland, but toward a destiny that even the stars might have whispered about. And so she watched until the shore of France was gone, her dark eyes searching the horizon, her hand resting on the rail. The sea stretched wide before her, its surface glimmering in the fading light, each wave carrying her nearer to the island kingdom, where a king's glance would one day set her upon a throne and later lead her to a scaffold. The ship's timbers groaned, the sails filled, and the sound of water broke against the prow, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo like a heartbeat, a reminder that time carries us forward whether we will it or not. Thus ends this chapter of Anne's youth, sealed upon the waters, where the sea itself seemed to murmur secrets of what lay ahead. And as night fell, the last detail we carry with us is the image of her standing alone at the rail, gazing back at a land she could no longer touch, while before her stretched England, with all its hidden snares and promises. She stood at the ship's rail, the salt air damp upon her skin, the sea darkening as twilight fell, and when the waters at last carried her to England, she stepped onto the familiar soil no longer as a girl, but as a woman, fashioned by foreign courts, a woman who had looked upon France with open eyes and who now returned with her thoughts shaped by its brilliance. The first breath of English air may have carried the scent of wet earth, the smoke of hearths, the sound of bells from distant churches, yet beneath it all there was the sense that her homeland had changed while she was away, or perhaps it was she herself who had changed, so that all familiar things seemed newly strange. The fields of Kent would still have been green, the walls of Hever Castle unchanged, but her heart was restless, and soon the paths of her life would lead her away from the quiet gardens of her youth into the golden and treacherous chambers of Henry's court. At first she found place in the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry's long-suffering wife. It was here, in those corridors hung with cloth of gold, that Anne's presence began to be noted. Not in an instant, for courts are places where eyes watch and measure slowly, but gradually, as though, drawn by an invisible tide, attention turned toward her. She did not blaze forth with beauty as some women did. Her appeal was of another kind. She was slender, with long, dark hair and eyes that seemed always to question, and she carried herself with such poise that she seemed taller than she was. Her gowns, cut in the French fashion, were elegant yet restrained, and her speech carried the music of another land, a soft cadence that gave even ordinary words the air of a secret. In the company of Queen Catherine, she learned much of the balance required in courtly life. Catherine was devout, dignified, a woman whose virtues were beyond question, yet whose fate was already shadowed by her inability to give Henry the male heir he longed for. To be in such a household was to witness both the grandeur of queenship and the fragility that lay beneath it. Anne, ever observant, must have taken note of how swiftly fortune could tilt when one's worth was measured by the life of a child yet unborn. Did she already wonder, even then, whether destiny might one day thrust her into such a perilous role? There are tales of how she first drew Henry's eye, tales embroidered by those who later sought to cast her as temptress or victim. Perhaps it was during a dance, when her movements caught the candlelight just so. Perhaps it was during a hunt, when her laughter carried across the air like a sudden note of music. Or perhaps it was nothing so dramatic, only the slow recognition of a presence that refused to fade from the king's mind. What is certain is that Henry's interest grew, and with it, Anne's life began to change course. Yet in these early days she did not yield to him as easily as her sister Mary had done before her. Mary had been Henry's mistress, a chapter closed without scandal. But Anne seemed determined not to be numbered among such fleeting attachments. She withheld herself, turned aside his advances with a mixture of modesty and wit, neither cold enough to banish him, nor warm enough to be conquered. In this lay her power, a subtle art learned perhaps in France, where women knew that denial could inflame desire more than surrender. Did she calculate her resistance? Or did she truly believe she could remain untouched? The answer lies lost in her heart, and history can only wonder. Meanwhile, others at court began to whisper. Some saw in her ambition, others inconstancy, others still the dangerous allure of a woman who could bend a king's will. Her enemies would later claim she bewitched him, that she used sorcery to ensnare his mind. Such charges reveal more of fear than of truth, but they hint at how extraordinary her effect was perceived to be. For a king to neglect his queen for a mistress was common enough, but for him to risk his crown and his soul for a woman who refused him, that was something altogether different. As Henry's attentions grew more insistent, Anne's world grew more precarious. The queen's supporters resented her. The courtiers watched her every move, and yet she walked among them with her head held high, her words quick and sharp, her manner unbowed. She was not content to be silent or to veil her mind. She spoke of matters beyond embroidery and music, spoke of scripture, of reform, of the needs of the kingdom. This, too, marked her apart, for few women dared such boldness in a court where even men were cautious with their words. One may imagine a night at Greenwich or Hampton Court, the great hall lit by torches, music playing while lords and ladies mingled, and among them Anne moving with a light step, her gown of deep color trailing behind, her gaze meeting the king's across the room. Around them the air thick with the scent of rushes and spiced wine, with laughter that covered the whisper of intrigue. Did she feel the weight of all those eyes upon her? Did she sense that every smile, every word was being noted and judged, and that her fate was even then being woven by unseen hands? The music fades, the torches burn low, the company disperses into the corridors, yet the echo of her presence lingers. Henry, restless in his chamber, cannot free his mind of her, and Anne, in her own chamber, perhaps, sat by candlelight, reading from a small book of scripture, her thoughts divided between devotion and the dangerous game that had begun. Thus her place at court was secured, not yet as queen, not yet even as betrothed, but as a figure around whom the very air seemed to shift. The stage was set for the long struggle that would follow, a struggle not only for the king's heart, but for the very soul of the kingdom. For now, though, we leave her in that hall, the music fading, the laughter gone, and the silence deepening into something almost ominous, and the last detail that remains is the faint echo of music, vanishing into stillness, a silence that will open the next passage of her life when Henry's desire became entangled with questions of marriage, faith, and the unyielding law of succession. The echo of music faded into stillness, and from that silence rose a different sound, the scratching of a quill upon parchment. For Henry, restless and consumed, began to pour his thoughts into letters. These letters, still preserved in fragments of ink upon paper, reveal more than any chronicler could invent. In them, the king writes, not as a distant sovereign, but as a man undone, pleading, cajoling, offering his heart and his throne to the woman who had awakened such desire within him. It is rare for us to glimpse the private soul of a monarch, but here we see Henry not as the mighty ruler of England, but as a lover, trembling before a refusal. He writes of torment, of sleepless nights, of the wound that only her acceptance could heal. His words flow with urgency, as though each page might soften her heart, and Anne, holding these letters in her hands, must have felt the strangeness of her position. To receive such passion from a king was both an honor and a burden, for to accept was to risk being only another mistress, discarded when novelty faded, while to refuse was to risk his wrath. She chose a path both daring and uncertain. She would not yield her body, but she would keep his heart. Thus the courtship stretched long, a slow dance of desire and denial. Each time he pressed her, she drew back, yet never so far as to end his pursuit. Each time he sought to claim her, she made him wait until his longing burned brighter still. It is said that he offered her everything short of marriage, but she insisted she would have no less. Did she believe truly that he might set aside his queen for her? Or was she simply holding her ground, determined that if she surrendered, it would be not as mistress but as wife? Perhaps even she did not know, for the game had become larger than either of them, drawn into the tangled cords of politics and religion. Meanwhile, Catherine of Aragon endured, steadfast and sorrowful, aware of her husband's straying affection. She had been queen for decades, had borne him children, though only a daughter, the Princess Mary, survived. Her dignity was unbroken, her devotion to Henry unwavering, yet her position grew ever more fragile as the king's heart wandered. To stand in her presence was to feel both reverence and pity, for she embodied the virtues of fidelity and faith, virtues that now seemed powerless against the force of Henry's obsession. Around them swirled the courtiers, each watching, each calculating. Some saw in Anne the promise of new favor, others saw danger. Her enemies muttered that she was ambitious, that she lured the king for her family's advancement. Her supporters whispered that she might be the answer to England's need for a son. And through it all, Henry grew more determined, convinced that his love for Anne was no mere passion but the will of God himself. He declared that his marriage to Catherine had been unlawful, cursed by the sin of marrying his brother's widow. If God had withheld sons from him, it was, he claimed, a sign that he must put Catherine aside and take Anne as his true wife. The court shivered with the enormity of this claim, for if a king could set aside a queen of such long standing, with papal approval and a daughter already recognized as legitimate, then nothing was safe, not law, not custom, not tradition. Yet Henry pressed forward, and Anne, whether with conviction or with careful patience, encouraged him. She spoke of reform, of the need for a pure church, of scripture that might be read in English. To Henry, these words seemed to echo his own desires, so that passion and policy became indistinguishable. Still, years passed. Letters went back and forth, meetings were held in secrecy, hopes rose and fell like the tide. At times, Henry seemed near to despair, writing that he could not endure the delay, that his health was suffering, that his heart was chained. At other times, he was fierce, declaring that he would bend the world to his will, that no pope, no emperor could stand against him, and Anne, through it all, remained firm. She would not be mistress, she would be wife, or she would be nothing. We might wonder what thoughts filled her mind in those long years. Did she dream of the crown, of the power it would bring, or did she simply cling to the hope that she might stand equal in the eyes of the man who adored her? Did she believe that God smiled upon her cause? Or did she fear, in secret moments, that she was being carried too far by forces she could not control? The truth is hidden, as it always is with hearts. What we know is only that she endured, holding her ground, while the king's desire grew ever more consuming. Picture her one evening at Hever, away from the court's pressures, seated by a fire, a letter from Henry in her lap. The flames cast shifting shadows on the walls, the night outside alive with owls and wind. She reads his words, words of longing and anguish, and though her face is calm, within her mind questions swirl. To refuse him outright might free her, but at what cost to her family's standing? To yield to him might destroy her honor. So she waits, neither closing the door nor opening it fully, and in that waiting she holds the destiny of a kingdom. The quill scratches still. Henry writes again and again, each page a testament to his fever. He speaks of rings, of promises, of his vow to make her his queen. And in this vow lies the seed of England's greatest upheaval, for to keep it, he must break not only with his wife, but with the church itself. Thus a courtship, born of desire, becomes the spark of a reformation. We leave them here, Anne with the letter in her hand, Henry with the ink still wet upon the page, both bound in a dance that neither could end. The scratching of the quill continues, the sound of destiny being written in lines of passion and plea, a sound that will lead us next into the great matter itself, where questions of marriage and faith would tear the realm apart. The scratching of the quill lingered in the chamber, and from those lines of ink there grew a storm that spread beyond love, beyond desire, into the very heart of Christendom. For Henry's longing to possess Anne entirely had taken on the form of a great question, one that came to be known as the king's great matter. He'd been married to Catherine of Aragon for more than 20 years, bound by vows blessed by the Pope himself. Yet he now declared that his conscience was troubled, that the marriage had been unlawful from the start. He argued that by wedding his brother's widow, he had broken divine law, and that God had punished this sin by denying him a living son. In this way, his passion for Anne was cloaked in the robes of religion, so that desire and doctrine became indistinguishable. The matter was no simple petition. It touched the authority of the Pope, the pride of Spain, the legitimacy of the Princess Mary, and the stability of the English crown. Catherine, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, aunt to the Emperor Charles V, stood unyielding. She declared her marriage true and holy, insisting that she had come to Henry's bed as a virgin, untouched by Arthur, his brother. She would not bend, for to admit otherwise was to brand her daughter a bastard, and herself a liar. In her steadfastness, she won the admiration of the people, who saw in her not only a queen but a woman of honor, and yet Henry pressed on. He summoned scholars, theologians, envoys. He sent pleas to Rome, demanding annulment. The Pope, caught between justice and politics, hesitated, stalled, delayed. The emperor's power weighed heavily on him, and Catherine was the emperor's kin. So years passed, with hearings, with councils, with endless arguments drawn from scripture and precedent, while Anne waited, caught in the coils of a struggle far greater than herself. How must she have felt in those days when her name was whispered in every hall, when her presence was seen as the root of the kingdom's turmoil? To some she was a beacon of new hope, the promise of renewal. To others she was the serpent in Eden, luring Henry to sin, threatening the sacred order of the realm. And she, still not queen, still not wife, bore the weight of being both savior and destroyer in the eyes of the world. Perhaps she walked in the gardens at Greenwich or Hampton Court, her thoughts heavy, listening to the wind in the trees, wondering if she had asked too much. Did she pray that Henry's cause would succeed, or did she tremble at the thought that she had set loose forces beyond control? For this was no longer a matter of affection alone, it was a question that might split the church itself. Meanwhile, Henry's passion did not cool. He spoke of Anne as though she were already his wife in the sight of God, though the law of man forbade it. He lavished gifts upon her, rings, jewels, a title, Marquess of Pembroke, rare for a woman to hold in her own right. At great ceremonies she shone, attended with honor, as though she were already queen. But beneath the splendor was tension, for every step forward brought more opposition. The people murmured against her, loyal to Catherine, who had been their queen for so long. Priests thundered from pulpits against the king's sin. In the inns and markets, her name was cursed, mocked, condemned. And yet Henry stood firm, declaring that his conscience demanded release. Conscience or passion? Who can say? The two were bound so tightly that even he may not have known the difference. At last, weary of papal delay, Henry resolved to act. He declared himself the head of the Church of England, severing the ancient tie with Rome. The monasteries trembled, the priests muttered, the people feared, but the king's will was done. And in that moment, all for the sake of a woman, England was set upon a path of reform and strife that would not end for generations. Through it all, Anne waited. She had been patient through years of uncertainty. She had endured scorn and slander. She had held Henry's desire without yielding her own honor. Now the crown itself seemed within her grasp, yet it came at the price of a kingdom's unity. Did she rejoice, or did she sense already the peril of being so deeply bound to such upheaval? We cannot know. We can only imagine her, standing in her chamber as word reached her that the break with Rome was sealed, that Henry's marriage to Catherine was declared null, and that she would soon be raised to the place for which she had waited so long. The ink upon parchment had grown into fire. The scratch of a quill had become the sound of kingdoms divided. And as the flames of Reformation spread, the image we carry forward is of a torn page of Scripture. The Latin words, half legible, half obscured, as though the old order itself were being ripped apart, leaving only fragments for the future to piece together. The torn page of Scripture fluttered like a wounded bird, its words broken and incomplete, and from that fragment grew Anne's triumph. For Henry's defiance of Rome opened the path he had promised her long ago. No longer bound by papal authority, he moved swiftly to raise her higher than any woman of her time. The year was 1532 when he granted her the title of Marquess of Pembroke, a dignity rare for a woman and rarer still to be held in her own right. In that moment, Anne stepped into a place that few dared to imagine. Her name now carried with weight and splendor, her presence no longer that of a courtier, but of a power in her own standing. The ceremony itself glittered with jewels and velvet, with courtiers bowing low, with trumpets proclaiming what many in England still could not accept, that this woman, once a lady-in-waiting, now stood almost equal to the queen herself. And yet, how strange that triumph can weigh heavier than obscurity. With her elevation, she became a figure of admiration and hatred alike. Those who had courted favor with her smiled broader, bowed deeper. Those who despised her muttered more bitterly, their whispers carrying through the halls and into the streets beyond. In London's markets, common folk called her usurper, concubine witch. To them, Catherine was still their rightful queen, pious and long-suffering, while Anne was the interloper, the woman who had stolen not only a husband, but the sacred stability of the realm. Did Anne hear those cries when she was carried through the city? Or did she shut them out, choosing instead to hear only the music, the applause of those whose loyalty shifted with the tide? Perhaps in her heart she knew that the voices of the people, once turned against her, might never be fully won. Yet Henry would not be swayed. He had waited too long, fought too fiercely to retreat now. In January of 1533, in secret and without pomp, he wed Anne, though the world did not yet know. Soon afterward, Thomas Cranmer, newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void, and his union with Anne true and lawful. Thus Catherine was cast aside, her daughter Mary branded illegitimate, and Anne was proclaimed Queen of England. The coronation followed that summer, a spectacle of grandeur designed to display her new station. She was carried through the streets in a litter of white and gold, her dark hair flowing loose about her shoulders, a crown gleaming upon her head. The river itself seemed to rejoice, for barges filled with musicians floated upon the Thames, their music echoing across the water. Bells rang from every church, trumpets blared, crowds gathered to see the new queen. Yet behind the music and pageantry, discontent simmered. Many watched in silence, some with sullen faces, others turning away. They had loved Catherine, and though they dared not defy the king openly, their hearts did not warm easily to Anne. Still, the day was hers, and she bore it with pride, her head high, her gaze steady, her body wrapped in the weight of robes that must have felt both glorious and crushing. Perhaps as she walked the length of Westminster Abbey, she felt the press of history upon her shoulders. Queens before her had come with lineage long established, with unions sanctified by church and people alike. She came instead with controversy, with defiance, with the sharp edge of scandal. Did she sense that this crown might sit more heavily upon her brow than upon any queen before her? Or did she let herself believe in that brief hour that she had won a victory that would last? Not long after, her triumph seemed complete, for word spread that she was with child. The kingdom rejoiced, or at least Henry did, for at last it seemed his patience would be rewarded, his prayers answered. The court buzzed with anticipation, wagers placed upon the birth of a son. Anne herself must have felt both hope and dread in those months, for she knew, as all knew, that her worth in the eyes of the king and the kingdom rested upon this unborn child. She had risen higher than any woman of her station, but she stood upon ground as fragile as glass. A son would secure her forever. A daughter would weaken her standing from the first cry. In September of that year, she gave birth. The bells rang out, the court gathered, the child was presented, a daughter. The princess was named Elizabeth. She was strong, healthy, with a bright cry and a face full of life. Yet for Henry, disappointment clouded joy. He had hoped for a son, and though he accepted the child with pride, the shadow of unfulfilled longing lay upon him. For Anne, the triumph of bearing a child was tempered by the knowledge that her place was not yet secure. She had given him an heir, but not the heir he craved. Still, in those first months, Elizabeth was celebrated, christened with splendor, guarded by a retinue that marked her as royal. Anne looked upon her with fierce devotion, perhaps sensing that this daughter, though not the son expected, might yet carry greatness within her. But how could she know that the infant in her arms would one day rule longer and more gloriously than any Tudor before her? That Elizabeth would shape an age, and that Anne herself would be remembered not only for her downfall, but for the life she brought into the world? For the moment, however, the crown rested uneasily upon her head. She was queen, yet she walked daily among enemies. Catherine, though banished, was not forgotten, and her daughter Mary still held the love of many. The court was divided, the kingdom restless, the pope furious, the emperor enraged. And Anne, though exalted, was vulnerable, her fate tied to the fragile thread of her ability to bear a son. As the bells of Elizabeth's christening faded, Anne must have felt the weight of expectation settling upon her anew. The robes of coronation still lay heavy in memory, and the cries of the crowd, some jubilant, some hostile, still echoed faintly in her ears. The crown she had long desired was hers. but with it came a burden greater than she could yet imagine. And so this chapter closes not with the certainty of triumph, but with the image of a crown resting heavy upon a head, the gold gleaming in torchlight, while beneath it a woman's brow bore the strain of hope and fear alike, a symbol of both victory and the peril that would soon follow. The crown rested heavy upon her head, gleaming with jewels yet pressing with unseen weight, and from that moment Anne's life as queen began in earnest, not in quiet splendor, but in ceaseless motion, for the business of royalty was unrelenting. Each day she awoke to attendants dressing her in silks and brocades, each meal taken with courtiers watching her every gesture, each evening filled with music, petitions, prayers, or the king's restless presence. She moved now not as a lady among others, but as the center of attention, her every word carried outward like a ripple upon water. In the tapestries of Hampton Court, in the stained glass of chapels, in the eyes of foreign ambassadors, she was the new queen, raised high by Henry's devotion and determination. Yet splendor brings its own solitude, and Anne, though adorned and exalted, must have felt the invisible circle tightening around her. Her coronation had been a spectacle, her marriage declared lawful by Cranmer, her place secured in name, yet beneath the ceremony lay unease. Many in England still called her concubine, still whispered that the king's soul was imperiled, that the Pope's curse hung over them all. Nobles long allied with Catherine of Aragon looked upon Anne with suspicion, their loyalty strained by their affection for the former queen. Even within her own household there were those who smiled by day and muttered by night. To be queen was to sit upon a seat of splendor, built atop shifting ground, and Anne must have known it. And yet, she did not shrink. She wore her role with confidence, even defiance. She appeared in rich gowns cut in the French style, jewels glittering at her throat and fingers, her dark eyes quick and lively. She conversed with scholars. She debated points of scripture. She encouraged the spread of English Bibles. She was not content to be a silent figurehead, nor a docile companion. She was, as she had always been, sharp of wit and bold of tongue, and in this she both captivated and endangered herself. Henry delighted in her quickness, her ability to match him in argument, her refusal to flatter without thought. Yet others, especially the older nobility, found her manner abrasive, unfitting for a queen. Where Catherine had been serene and pious, Anne was lively and contentious. Where Catherine had spoken little, Anne spoke much, and often too frankly for those who preferred the safe silences of custom. Still, in these early years of her queenship, her position seemed radiant. She rode at Henry's side on progresses through the countryside. She presided over feasts. She was honored by foreign guests. In 1534, she gave birth again, though the child was still born, a grief kept quiet yet felt keenly. She was soon with child once more, and hope revived, for each pregnancy was a chance to secure her place with a son. Henry, though disappointed, remained devoted, convinced that God would bless their union in time. Anne, in turn, gave him her counsel, her laughter, her spirited presence, and in their private chambers they shared moments of closeness that few could imagine amid the roar of public life. Yet even then, shadows lengthened. Among those shadows was Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister. At first, he and Anne had been allies, both favoring reform, both rising through Henry's favor. But as Cromwell moved to dissolve monasteries and seize their wealth, Anne began to oppose him, fearing his ambition, questioning his motives. In Cromwell's keen mind, such opposition was dangerous, for he knew how quickly a queen's influence could shape the king's will. Quietly, their friendship cooled into rivalry, and from rivalry grew enmity. Another shadow was Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting, quiet and pale, who caught Henry's attention even as Anne still fought to secure his. Unlike Anne, Jane seemed meek, submissive, gentle, a contrast that appealed to a king growing weary of sharp words and bold demands. At first, it was but a flicker of notice, a glance here, a smile there, but in time it would grow into a flame that consumed all. For now, though, Anne was still queen, still adorned with honors. When she walked through the palace gardens, the scent of roses and lavender about her, attendants trailing behind, she must have felt both pride and weariness. Pride, for she had achieved what few thought possible, raised from lady-in-waiting to queen, crowned and anointed. Weariness, for each day was a struggle to maintain her position, to outmaneuver enemies, to bear the weight of expectation. In the evenings, when the court fell silent and only the wind stirred the trees, perhaps she sat alone and thought of Hever, of her childhood walks by quiet streams, of simpler days when the future was not yet entwined with crowns and swords. And yet ambition has its own momentum, carrying one forward whether the heart longs for peace or not. She had sought the crown, and now it was hers with all its burdens. Did she regret? Did she question? Or did she, even then, believe that she could triumph still, that a son would silence her enemies, that Henry's love would remain unbroken? We cannot know. History shows us only her actions, her words recorded by others, often hostile, often shaped by the malice of hindsight. But in the quiet of her chamber, as candles burned low, she must have wrestled with thoughts unspoken, caught between pride in what she had won and fear of what might yet be lost. The days of splendor continued, feasts and progresses, prayers and debates, yet the ground beneath her feet grew ever more unsteady. Anne was radiant still, a queen crowned and adorned, yet already she felt the tremor of approaching storms. And so we leave her here, the gold crown resting heavy, the jewels glittering, while in the shadows of the hall whispers begin to stir, whispers that will soon swell into the voices of rivals and enemies. The image that carries us forward is that of a crown upon her head, gleaming in torchlight, but beneath the gold the strain upon her brow grows sharper, the silent mark of a burden that no splendor could disguise. The crown still gleamed upon her brow in the torchlight, but its weight pressed deeper with each passing season, and with it came the true trials of queenship, trials not of ceremony and jewels, but of the body and the heart. For Anne knew, as did Henry, as did all of England, that her greatness and her safety rested not upon crowns or titles, but upon the cry of a son in the cradle. The memory of Elizabeth's christening lingered. Bells ringing, courtiers gathered, the tiny princess wrapped in cloth of gold, and though Anne loved her daughter fiercely, she understood that joy was shadowed by disappointment. The king had smiled, but behind his smile was longing unfulfilled, and behind her triumph was the whisper of uncertainty. In the months that followed, Anne bent all her hope toward securing her place. She watched Elizabeth with tenderness, perhaps whispering to her that she was born for greatness, even if the world did not yet know. She chose her ladies carefully. She sought to surround herself with those who might guard her against enemies, and she clung to Henry's side with both affection and necessity. Yet in her chamber, in moments of solitude, she must have prayed with fervor, prayed that the child she bore next would be a boy, prayed that God would grant her the one gift that would silence all her doubters. Her prayers seemed answered when she conceived again, and the court waited with anticipation. Henry, restless and eager, spoke openly of the son soon to come, already imagining him as heir, as prince, as the fulfillment of his long pursuit. But fate, so often cruel in its indifference, denied them. The child, born too soon or lost in the womb, left Anne weakened and Henry bitterly disappointed. Whispers spread quickly, as they always did in a court where every secret was a coin. Some said it was punishment for sin, others that the Queen's body was cursed, others still that God had turned his face from England. Anne, hearing these murmurs, must have felt the ground slipping beneath her feet, each miscarriage not only a personal grief, but a public wound. Yet she did not collapse into silence. She remained proud. She spoke boldly. She matched Henry's moods with words both tender and sharp. Her quick tongue, once part of her allure, now cut her deeper into danger. When Henry grew sullen, she rebuked him. When he strayed, she confronted him. She was not Catherine, patient and devout, but Anne, fiery and unafraid, and this difference, which once had captivated, now began to weary him. Still, he could not abandon her yet, for she remained his queen, and in her womb lay the promise, however fragile, of sons to come. Meanwhile, Elizabeth grew, a bright-eyed child. Her small figure carried through palace corridors, her laugh lightening Anne's weary heart. Perhaps in those moments Anne forgot the weight of crowns, the whispers of rivals, and simply held her daughter close, imagining a future in which Elizabeth's worth would be recognized, in which a girl could rule as well as any boy. But in the 16th century, such imaginings were fragile, little more than dreams that few took seriously. As the years passed, Anne's pregnancies brought only sorrow. A stillbirth in 1534, another miscarriage in 1536, each one striking at her health and her spirit. Henry's patience grew thin, his eyes wandering toward Jane Seymour, whose gentle silence was a balm to his pride. Anne saw the danger, felt it like a knife beneath the skin, yet her nature would not allow her to shrink or yield. She confronted Henry, she pleaded, she wept, she raged, and in each reaction she showed him the intensity that had once drawn him, but now reminded him too much of his own failures. For in Anne's struggle was reflected Henry's own frustration, his fear that his line would end without the son he craved. At court, the atmosphere thickened. Cromwell, once ally, now enemy, worked quietly against her, aligning himself with those who longed for her fall. The Seymours waited patiently, their fortunes tied to Jane's rising star. Old nobles muttered that the queen was arrogant, too bold, too meddling. And beyond the walls, the people still remembered Catherine with sorrow and reverence, seeing in Anne not their motherly queen, but the woman who had displaced her. Yet Anne did not retreat into shadows. She continued to support reform, to protect scholars, to read scripture in English, to speak of a church unbound by Rome. She sought to guide Henry's policies, to wield influence not only as wife but as partner. In this, she showed a spirit rare among queens of her time, a spirit that would one day echo in her daughter's reign. But in Henry's eyes, the brilliance that once enchanted him now burned too hot, a flame that singed rather than warmed. Imagine her one evening, sitting alone in her chamber, the flicker of candles casting long shadows across the walls. Before her lies a cradle, empty, save for a coverlet untouched. She gazes at it in silence, her hands folded tightly, her thoughts unspoken. Outside, the wind rattles the windows, carrying with it the voices of courtiers, the murmur of rivals, the footsteps of a husband slipping toward another woman. In that moment, what did she feel? Anguish, no doubt, but also defiance, for Anne was never one to surrender meekly. Even in grief, she would lift her head, though the tears burned her eyes, determined to hold what she had seized, even as fate itself seemed determined to undo her. The crown still gleamed, but it gleamed now with a sharper light, more like a blade than a jewel. Each time she entered the hall, each time she sat at Henry's side, she must have felt the unspoken judgment of every gaze. The triumph of her coronation had faded into the relentless trial of queenship, and though she bore herself proudly, the burden grew heavier with each lost child, each whisper of scandal, each glance Henry gave to another. Thus we leave her for now in that chamber, the empty cradle before her, the crown upon her head, and in her eyes a mixture of pride, sorrow, and unyielding will. The sound that carries us forward is the soft cry of a newborn, imagined but never born, a sound that fades into silence, leading us into the shadows of rivalry and enmity that will soon surround her more closely than ever before. The silence after the imagined cry of the child lingered heavy in the chamber, more piercing than any sound could have been, and from that silence spread the chill of Anne's growing isolation. For in those quiet spaces of loss, her enemies drew nearer, emboldened by each miscarriage, each sign that her womb might never give the king the son he craved. Where once her laughter had filled the halls, now whispers moved in her place, carried in secret by those who saw in her faltering fortune the chance to rise themselves. Jane Seymour, pale and reserved, stood now at the edge of Henry's gaze, a figure of meekness whose silence was more alluring than Anne's brilliance. She was a lady in waiting, trained in modesty, a woman who lowered her eyes and spoke little, who seemed to Henry a balm after years of Anne's sharpness and fire. To Anne, she must have appeared like a shadow creeping across the sun, unremarkable in herself, but dangerous in what she represented. A softer queen, a quieter queen, a queen whose very stillness might soothe the king's restless pride. And though Anne had once conquered Catherine by her allure, she now faced a rival who conquered her by restraint. Cromwell, too, had turned his face from her. Once they had shared cause in the reforms that reshaped the church, but ambition had set them apart. Anne opposed his ruthless seizures of wealth, questioning his designs, and Cromwell, keen as a blade, understood that her disfavor could undo him if Henry's love endured. Yet he also saw that her grip upon Henry was loosening, and in that loosening he found his chance. Slowly, carefully, he shifted his loyalty, aligning himself with those who favored Jane Seymour and those nobles who longed for Catherine's daughter Mary to be restored. The court grew colder around Anne. She still bore the crown, still walked with regal grace, yet each step was shadowed. Courtiers who once rushed to greet her now hesitated, bowing without warmth, speaking without devotion. Ambassadors reported her quarrels with the king, her miscarriages, her waning favor, and foreign rulers, once wary of her power, began to dismiss her as a figure soon to be swept aside. Within England, the common people muttered still of Catherine, mourning her recent death with sorrow, while Anne was blamed for every misfortune that touched the realm. Yet Anne did not fold into silence. Her spirit, unbending, still flashed. She rebuked Henry when she found Jane upon his knee. She reminded him of the sacrifices she had made. She pleaded with him in tears when her strength faltered. At times her words swayed him. At times they drove him further away. For Henry, accustomed now to deference, grew weary of her boldness, and in his weariness he began to see in Jane the very opposite of Anne, gentle, compliant, unthreatening. The miscarriage of 1536 cut deepest of all. It was said to have been a boy, lost too soon, and Henry's disappointment was mingled with anger so bitter that Anne herself cried out that she had been bewitched. In that cry we glimpse her despair, for she who had once stood unshaken now felt the storm breaking over her, her own words twisted into omens of downfall. To Henry, this last loss was not only grief, but a sign, perhaps even a judgment, that God had withheld his favor from their union. And if God had withheld favor, then even love could not save her. Cromwell moved quickly, his mind already weaving the net. He knew the king would not long endure a queen who brought only sorrow, and he knew that Henry's eye turned more intently toward Jane. But to rid the king of Anne required more than dismissal. Then, Catherine had been set aside, but she had been noble, virtuous, unassailable. Anne was different. She could be cast not merely as a failed wife, but as a traitor, a danger, a woman whose very nature threatened the stability of the crown. And so rumors were gathered, accusations whispered, names collected, men of the court, friends, even her own brother. Cromwell worked in shadows, preparing the charges that would undo her, and each day Anne walked, unknowing, into the snare being laid at her feet. Imagine her then, standing in a palace corridor, her gown trailing, her eyes fierce, her words still proud, yet around her the air heavy with betrayal. Servants glanced aside, courtiers whispered as she passed. Henry's smile grew thin. Perhaps she felt it, perhaps she sensed in her bones that the circle was tightening, though she would not admit it aloud. For Anne was never one to surrender before the blow fell. She still wore the crown with pride, still held her head high, still believed that she might yet prevail. But in the shadows of those halls, the murmur of voices grew louder, voices that spoke not only of failure, but of scandal, of sin, of crimes unspoken. The queen, who had risen by whispers, would now be undone by them. Thus we leave her here, in the dim corridors of court, the crown still upon her head, but the silence of allies around her growing deeper. And the last detail we carry forward is a murmur behind a closed door, the low sound of conspirators weaving threads that would soon bind her in accusations she could not escape. The murmur behind the closed door did not cease. It swelled, multiplied, until it became the hum of plots woven in secret chambers, a hum that reached Anne, though she could not yet name its source. The court was never silent. There was always music, laughter, the shuffle of servants' feet, but beneath it ran a darker undertone, like a low note struck again and again beneath the melody. Unnoticed by some, but by others, felt in the bones. Anne, proud and quick, must have heard it even if she did not yet understand that it was the sound of her own undoing. Thomas Cromwell had chosen his moment. He had long studied men's hearts, their fears, their ambitions, and he knew how to bind them into cords strong enough to pull down even a queen. He whispered of disloyalty, of betrayals unthinkable, of sins committed in shadows. He named men: Henry Norris, Mark Smeaton, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and most damning of all, George Boleyn, Anne's brother. He spoke of stolen glances, of words overheard, of meetings that might have been innocent but could be painted otherwise. He knew that in the fevered imagination of a court, rumor was proof enough, and he trusted that Henry's growing weariness with Anne would supply the rest. The charges were whispered first in corridors, then carried to the king's ear. Adultery, treason, incest, crimes so vile that to speak them aloud was to blacken her name forever. And yet they were spoken, and once spoken, they could not be unsaid. Henry, who had once poured out letters of love, who had once defied Rome and torn his kingdom asunder for her, now listened with tightening jaw, with wounded pride, with the hunger for justification. For in these charges he found not only reason to cast Anne aside, but also the balm of believing that God had not cursed him without cause. If she were guilty, then his misfortunes were explained. If she were guilty, then he himself was free of blame. Anne knew nothing of this web at first. She continued her days as queen, still attending to Elizabeth, still sparring with Henry, still speaking her mind where others would have stayed silent. But the shadows were lengthening, and soon they fell upon her without warning. In May of 1536, she was summoned, accused, and arrested. Imagine her in that moment, the sudden knock at the door, the faces of men who once bowed in respect, now hardened in duty. She was led away, bewildered, protesting her innocence, her voice sharp, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a queen to fall so swiftly was almost beyond imagining, and yet it was happening, step by inexorable step. She was taken to the Tower, the same place where she had once entered in triumph for her coronation. How bitter that return must have been. The stones she had passed with joy now loomed like prison walls. The river that had carried her to glory now carried her into disgrace. As the gates closed behind her, she must have felt the weight of betrayal pressing upon her shoulders, heavier even than the crown had done. In the days that followed, the charges were read. She was accused of lying with men not her husband, of conspiring against the king. even of sin with her own brother. To Anne, proud and quick of tongue, these accusations were madness, insults so grotesque that they seemed almost laughable. She denied them all, speaking with the same clarity she had always possessed, swearing upon her honor, upon her soul, that she was innocent. Yet innocence mattered little, for the tide had already turned. Cromwell had gathered his net too tightly, and Henry, seeking release, had already decided her fate. The men accused with her were tried first: Norris, Smeaton, Weston, Brereton, and George Boleyn. Each one denied save Smeaton, who under torment confessed, though whether truthfully or not no one could know. His confession was enough. The others, though noble, though friends, were condemned. Their deaths would come swiftly, but Anne's trial was to be the greater spectacle. On the day she was brought forth, the hall was crowded with peers and lords, all summoned to judge her. She walked with composure, her gown simple, her face pale but steady. Before them all she stood, accused of crimes that cut to the very soul of womanhood, accused not only of betrayal, but of monstrous acts that stained her name beyond repair. She listened as the charges were read, her head held high, and when she spoke, it was with a voice clear enough to carry through the chamber. She denied them all, denied them with the passion of one who knows her innocence, and yet knows also that innocence will not save her. Those who watched her that day could not agree. Some said she seemed haughty still, unrepentant, too bold for a woman accused. Others said she moved hearts with her dignity, her courage, her composure in the face of ruin. But whatever they thought, the verdict was foregone. She was found guilty, guilty of adultery, guilty of treason, guilty of plotting the king's death. A sentence of death was pronounced, and the court dispersed, leaving her to her fate. In the silence that followed, Anne must have felt the cold hand of destiny upon her. She had risen higher than any woman of her station, and now she was to fall more swiftly than any queen before her. The crown, once heavy, was now gone. The chains, once invisible, were now iron. In her chamber in the tower, she prayed, she wept, she laughed, she despaired, her moods shifting like clouds across a stormy sky. For to be condemned unjustly is a torment greater than the sentence itself, and Anne bore it with all the intensity of her spirit. The murmur behind the closed door had grown into a roar, and now the roar had delivered her into silence. The last image of this chapter is the sharpening of a blade, the cold rasp of steel drawn across stone, a sound that would linger in her mind as the promise of an end yet to come. The rasp of the blade against stone carried through the silence, like the whisper of fate, and in its echo we are led first not to Anne, but to the men whose names had been bound to hers, men who shared her condemnation and who would go before her into death. For the scaffold at Tower Hill was prepared not for a queen alone, but for 5 courtiers, companions, and in one case, a brother, all accused of treasonous sin. Henry Norris, trusted groom of the stool, Francis Weston, young and lively, William Brereton, a man of power in the Welsh marches, Mark Smeaton, the musician whose confession, drawn perhaps by torture, perhaps by fear, had lent false weight to the charges, and George Boleyn, Anne's brother, whose wit and learning had once delighted the court. They were brought out one by one, the crowd pressing close to witness, for executions were not only punishments, but public dramas, stages upon which the kingdom's fears and loyalties were displayed. Each man proclaimed his innocence, or at least refused to confess guilt beyond what had been forced from him, yet none were spared. The axe fell again and again, and with each stroke Anne's world grew smaller, for those who had stood beside her in laughter and conversation, those who had shared her family's rise, now lay silent in death. George, her beloved brother, was the last. He mounted the scaffold with courage, speaking with the eloquence that had long been his gift. and then he too was struck down, his head raised for the crowd to see. Anne, confined within the tower, must have heard the drums, the murmur of the gathered multitude, perhaps even the dull thud of the axe, though the walls muffled sound. Did she know, as the hours passed, that each man had gone to his end? Did she pray for their souls, or did she rage against the injustice that had swept them all into ruin? In her heart there must have been both grief and guilt, for though innocent, she could not deny that their deaths were bound to her fate, that her rise had drawn them into peril, and that her fall had dragged them down beside her. The loss of George, in particular, cut deep. Brother and sister, they had shared not only blood but spirit. Both were quick of wit, fond of learning, unafraid to speak boldly. At court they had been a pair, admired and resented alike, their closeness turned against them by the foul charge of incest. Now he was gone, condemned by a verdict no truth could justify. Alone in her chamber, Anne is said to have fallen into strange humors, at times laughing, at times weeping, at times speaking as though already beyond the reach of worldly cares. Some believed she had lost her senses, others thought it courage, a refusal to bow even to despair, yet her end had not yet come. She was still queen in name, still alive, though condemned. The king, perhaps to show mercy, perhaps to ease his conscience, arranged that she should not die by the axe, which often required more than one blow, but by the sword, brought specially from France. It was a strange gesture, at once cruel and kind, for it spared her suffering, but underscored the spectacle of her death. A skilled swordsman was summoned, swift and precise, so that when the moment came, it would be over in an instant. In those final days, Anne prepared herself with prayer. She spoke to her ladies, forgiving those who had betrayed her, asking pardon for her own sharpness, declaring her innocence, yet also her submission to God's will. Her words, recorded by those present, reveal a woman who faced death not with bitterness, but with a curious serenity. She knew she had been wronged, but she also knew that railing against it would change nothing. In the stillness of her confinement, she seemed to shed the trappings of queenship, to return to something purer, something unshaken by the malice of men. The tower itself must have seemed alive with memory in those hours. The ravens circling above, the stones damp with centuries of sorrow, the river flowing past as it had for all who had come there never to return. Anne, walking in the gardens within the walls, must have felt the closeness of time, as though she walked not only among soldiers and attendants, but among the shades of all who had passed before her. The scent of grass, the cool air upon her face, the distant sound of bells from the city, each detail sharpened by the knowledge that soon she would no longer breathe or see or hear. Her ladies wept, but Anne herself often comforted them, speaking with a calmness that astonished. "Do not weep for me," she might have said, "for I am going to a better place." Whether those words were of faith or of courage, they reveal a strength that endured even as the world collapsed around her. She had risen by ambition, lived in splendor, fought fiercely, and now she faced death with grace. In that, perhaps, she found a kind of victory. The sharpening of the blade had been the sound of others' ends, now it was the promise of her own. The last image we carry forward is not yet of the scaffold, but of Anne standing at the narrow window of her chamber, gazing out at the pale sky above the tower grounds, her hands folded, her lips moving in prayer, while somewhere beyond the walls the foreign swordsman sharpened his blade in silence, waiting for the day when his skill would be called upon. At the narrow window she stood, gazing outward across the tower grounds, the May sky pale and still above her, her lips moving in prayer while the world beyond her walls prepared for her end. The air through that window carried the scent of damp stone and grass, and faintly the distant murmur of London, carts creaking on their wheels, voices in the markets, the tolling of bells. Life continued outside, indifferent to the fate of a queen, and perhaps in that indifference Anne found her thoughts turning not to power or ambition, but to the simple rhythm of existence, to the breath of wind on her face, to the sound of her own heart steady in her chest. The days in the tower passed slowly, each hour stretched thin as she waited. She prayed often, reciting words she had known since childhood, but now they took on new weight, for they were no longer habits of piety, but her final companions. She confessed to her chaplain, she spoke with her ladies, she wept at times, but more often she seemed calm, as though the fever of her struggle had burned itself out. To those around her, it appeared she had accepted her fate with grace, even serenity. Yet within her, surely, waves of memory and regret rose and fell. The laughter of Elizabeth as an infant, the bright days at the French court, Henry's words of love when their passion was new, the crown laid upon her head amid splendor. These memories must have come unbidden, piercing her calm with the sharpness of all that had been lost. Her ladies remained with her, faithful to the end. They dressed her, comforted her, wept beside her. To them she spoke with gentleness, asking that they remember her kindly, that they pray for her soul. She gave them small tokens, jewels or pieces of cloth, as though to leave behind fragments of herself in their keeping. She thanked them for their service, and when they wept, she bid them be still, telling them she went to a better place. It is said she laughed at times, a strange bright laughter, sudden and startling, as though her spirit, strained to its limit, had found release in mirth rather than despair. Some thought it madness, others courage, others a final defiance of fear. On the night before her appointed death, she is said to have prayed long, then slept more peacefully than those who kept watch. The morning came, bright with sunlight that seemed at odds with sorrow, and Anne rose to meet it as one who rises for a solemn festival rather than for doom. She dressed with care, choosing a gown of dark gray or black, her mantle trimmed with ermine, her hood framing her face. She arranged herself with the dignity of a queen, not of a prisoner, and in that act she claimed her last moment of sovereignty. Outside, carpenters had prepared the scaffold within the Tower grounds, for Henry would not permit her to die upon Tower Hill before the multitude. Instead, she would perish in a more contained space, before a smaller company of witnesses, though still enough to bear her memory outward. The French swordsman had arrived, his blade keen, his skill certain, chosen that she might die swiftly, with one clean stroke. This mercy, if mercy it was, had been granted not for her sake but for Henry's conscience, yet in it lay some fragment of dignity denied to many. As she prepared, Anne spoke again to her attendants, forgiving those who had wronged her, commending her daughter Elizabeth to God's keeping, declaring her innocence of the crimes laid upon her, yet submitting to the judgment of the king. Her words, preserved by those present, ring still across the centuries, that she prayed for the king, that she would not accuse him, that she accepted death as God's will. In this she showed a grace that silenced even her enemies, for no bitterness passed her lips at the last. One may imagine her walking from her chamber through the tower, each step measured, the echo of her tread upon the stone sounding like the toll of a slow bell. The sunlight fell across her face as she emerged into the open air, the scaffold rising before her draped in black. Around it stood guards, officials, a few lords summoned to witness, and beyond them a crowd hushed into silence. The air was filled with the scent of spring, flowers budding, the river glimmering beyond, as though nature itself offered her a farewell more gentle than men would give. She mounted the scaffold with composure, her head high, her movement steady. The crowd pressed close, watching, waiting. She looked upon them and spoke, her voice clear, asking that they pray for her soul, declaring once more that she had always been faithful to the king, commending him to God, and ending with a simple farewell. Those who heard her remarked upon her courage, upon the dignity with which she faced her end, and then she knelt, removing her headdress so that her neck was bare. The swordsman approached silently, his blade gleaming in the light. Anne's lips moved in prayer, her eyes lifted upward. Her ladies wept softly, unable to look away. The moment stretched, a stillness so deep that the very air seemed to hold its breath. Yet before the blade fell, let us pause here, for this is not yet the end of her story, but the threshold. The image we carry forward is of Anne kneeling upon the scaffold, her dark hair falling loose, her face lifted toward heaven, her hands folded, while behind her the swordsman shifts his feet upon the boards, preparing to strike. She knelt upon the scaffold, her hair falling loose beneath the hood she had removed, her face lifted to the pale sky, her lips moving in prayer, and around her the crowd stood in such stillness that even the birds seemed to have ceased their song. The French swordsman, summoned for his swiftness, stepped lightly, his blade hidden at first so that she might not see it gleam. He whispered to his assistants in his own tongue, his manner almost casual, for he was practiced in this art, yet every movement carried the weight of finality. The boards beneath Anne's knees were rough, the air cool against her skin, and though the silence pressed hard, she did not tremble. Her ladies, gathered nearby, wept softly, unable to stifle their grief, their tears falling not only for their queen, but for the world that seemed, in that moment, overturned. Anne spoke her last words, recorded by those who listened. She declared her innocence. She prayed for the king. She asked that Christ receive her soul. No bitterness crossed her lips, no accusations, though she must have known she had been betrayed. Instead, she chose grace, as if in that final act she wished to leave not scandal, but peace behind her. Her voice, though soft, carried clearly in the still air, and when it fell silent, the pause was long enough for every heart present to feel the beat of its own mortality. The swordsman moved closer, his steps light, his presence almost gentle. He called for his sword, though it was already in his hand, a ruse to turn her gaze aside. She looked away, perhaps toward the river, perhaps toward the Tower Chapel, her lips still forming words of prayer. And in that instant, while her mind was lifted heavenward, the blade swept in a single clean stroke. It was said the sword was so sharp, the hand so skilled, that her head was taken before the crowd could draw breath. The silence after was deeper than any before, a silence broken only by the faint cry of a woman among the onlookers, or perhaps by the sob of one of her ladies who rushed forward to gather the body. Her head was placed upon the straw, her body upon the boards, and the witnesses, as custom demanded, stepped back. Some crossed themselves, others turned away quickly, unable to bear the sight. The executioner, finished with his work, wiped his blade and stood still. And thus it was done, swift and irrevocable. The life of a queen ended in the space between heartbeats. The crowd did not cheer, for there was no triumph in this death. They dispersed slowly, murmuring, some stunned into silence, some whispering that justice had been served, others wondering if they had just seen an innocent condemned. The spring air seemed sharper, the sunlight too bright, as if the world itself recoiled from what had been done. Her ladies, faithful to the end, gathered her remains with trembling hands. They placed her body and head in a simple coffin, and she was buried quickly within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, unmarked save for those who knew the place. No great monument was raised, no songs were sung in her honor, only the quiet closing of the earth over one who had once worn a crown. And what of Henry? He did not linger in mourning. Even as Anne's blood was fresh upon the straw, he rode out to Jane Seymour, already preparing to wed her. His heart, restless as ever, had turned fully away, and with Anne's death he declared his conscience clear. Yet history does not so easily absolve, for though Henry sought to forget her, the world remembered, and the shadow of Anne Boleyn lingered in every chamber, in every glance at the child she had borne. Elizabeth, left motherless at 2 years of age, was declared illegitimate. her place at court uncertain. But she would grow, and in time she would rise, and the blood spilled upon that May morning would echo across the decades in her reign. In that sense, Anne's death was not an end but a seed, for from her downfall sprang a legacy greater than she herself could have imagined. The scaffold was taken down, the boards removed, the ground washed clean, yet those who had stood there never forgot the sight of the Queen kneeling, the sword flashing, the silence falling. Such images do not fade. They etch themselves into memory as surely as stone into water. And as the sun sank that evening, casting long shadows across the tower, the ravens circled overhead, their wings black against the fading light, as if marking the passing of a soul. Thus ends the moment that had been foreshadowed from the first beat of the drum on that May morning. The image we carry forward is not of the blade, nor of the crowd dispersing, but of the hush that followed, the stillness so deep it seemed to reach beyond the walls, beyond the city, into the hearts of all who knew that England had been altered forever by the fall of a queen. The hush after the sword's swift stroke lingered like a veil upon the tower, a silence deeper than mourning, a silence that seemed to echo into every chamber and passageway. It clung to the stones even after the crowd had dispersed, after the scaffold boards had been cleared, after the coffin was lowered into the chapel earth. That hush was not merely the stillness of death, but the hollow breath of a realm, pausing, uncertain, before it moved again. Yet time does not stop, and in the days that followed, the silence gave way to hurried steps, to whispers of new beginnings, to the startling swiftness with which Henry cast aside his former queen. For even as Anne's blood was yet fresh upon the straw, the king was already turning toward Jane Seymour, the pale figure who had waited quietly at the margins. Jane was everything Anne had not been, meek where Anne had been fiery, yielding where Anne had been sharp, silent where Anne had spoken too freely. In her, Henry saw not only the promise of peace, but the possibility of a son, for his desire for an heir burned still with unquenched urgency. Within days of Anne's death, he was betrothed to Jane, and by the end of the month, they were wed. To many, the haste was shocking, indecent even, but Henry's heart did not dwell upon decency. He sought only forward motion, leaving the past buried in the Tower Chapel. What must those days have been for Elizabeth, the child of barely 2 years, suddenly stripped of her mother and her queenly status? She was declared illegitimate, her place in the succession cast into shadow, her future uncertain. Yet she lived, and in her life the echo of Anne endured. The little girl, with her red gold hair and quick intelligence, carried within her the legacy of the woman now laid in the earth. Perhaps Anne, in her final prayers, had whispered her daughter's name, commending her to God's care. If so, her prayers were answered in ways unseen, for Elizabeth would one day rise beyond every obstacle, though none could foresee it then. For the people of England, the days after Anne's death were filled with unease. Some rejoiced, believing that justice had been served, that the king had been delivered from a witch who had bewitched his heart. Others mourned silently, troubled by the swiftness of her fall, doubtful of the charges that had condemned her. In taverns and markets the talk was low, for none dared speak too loudly, yet the sense of disquiet hung in the air. A queen had been executed, not set aside, not banished, but killed by the state, and such a thing was rare and unsettling. The very foundations of loyalty trembled, for if a queen could be condemned and slain, what protection had any subject? Within the court, the courtiers adjusted swiftly, as courtiers always do. Those who had bowed to Anne now bowed to Jane, their words of loyalty as quick to change as the seasons. Cromwell stood secure, his work done, his favor with the king renewed. The Seymours, raised suddenly into prominence, looked upon their sister with pride, their ambitions tethered now to Henry's longing for a son. and Henry himself moved as though the past were already forgotten, as though Anne had been a brief storm now past, leaving the sky clear for new beginnings. But history does not forget so easily. Though Henry sought to erase her, to blacken her name, to declare her guilty and unworthy, Anne's image remained in memory, sharper for her fall. She was remembered in whispers, in the words of foreign envoys, in the songs of common folk who spoke of her beauty, her wit, her rise and her ruin. Some painted her as a temptress who had brought about her own destruction, others as a martyr, undone by envy and the king's ingratitude. The truth, as always, lay tangled between. The hush that followed her death spread outward across Europe. Kings and queens, popes and emperors heard the news with a mixture of awe and unease. They had watched Henry's break with Rome, his marriage to Anne, his defiance of tradition, and now they saw how swiftly he had cast her aside, even to the point of execution. For them, it was a sign not only of Henry's passion, but of his ruthlessness, a reminder that England's crown was now guided by a will that bowed neither to church nor to custom. And what of Anne herself, remembered now only in stories, in records, in the life of her daughter? In the hush that followed her execution, her image began to shift, to be shaped not by her own words, but by the words of others. To some, she was the woman who had led a king astray. To others, the victim of a man's caprice and a minister's plot. To the people who lived near Hever, she may have remained the girl who once walked the gardens with quick steps and watchful eyes. To her daughter, though Elizabeth would never fully remember her, she remained the mother whose blood ran in her veins, whose fierce spirit would echo in her reign. The hush did not last forever. It gave way to the sound of bells, not for Anne, but for Henry's new bride, to the hum of court life shifting around a new queen, to the daily rhythms of a kingdom that moved ever onward. But for those who had stood within the tower that morning, for those who had seen the sword flash and the silence fall, the hush remained within them, a memory that would not fade. And so we leave this moment not with noise, but with quiet, the quiet of a realm adjusting, of courtiers whispering, of a child left motherless. The image that carries us forward is of Elizabeth herself, small and fragile, playing in her chamber, unaware of the storm that had consumed her mother, while outside the bells ring for another queen. Elizabeth played in her chamber, a child of 2 years with bright eyes and hair kissed with gold, her laughter carrying lightly through the halls, though she could not know that outside those walls her world had shifted beyond repair. For her mother was gone, laid quietly in the earth of the Tower Chapel, and though Elizabeth's hands still reached for her, there was only emptiness in return. To those who cared for her, she was now the daughter of a disgraced queen, branded illegitimate by the king's decree, her title stripped, her future uncertain, and yet, in her innocence, she played on the sound of her joy, a fragile counterpoint to the hush that still lingered in the kingdom after Anne's death. Henry himself saw little of her, for his heart had already turned wholly toward Jane Seymour, the new wife who promised him peace and the hope of a son. Yet Elizabeth was not forgotten entirely. She remained within the royal household, her needs attended, her life preserved, though her place in the line of succession had been erased as swiftly as her mother's memory was condemned. To Henry, she was no longer the princess who might secure the Tudor line, but a shadow of past failure, a reminder of a union that had ended in blood. Still she lived, and in her survival, Anne's legacy endured, though few could see it then. For those who had loved Anne, Elizabeth's presence was both comfort and sorrow. Her governesses, her attendants may have looked upon her and seen the shape of her mother's eyes, the tilt of her head, the quick spark in her expression. They whispered among themselves that Anne lived on in her daughter, that though her voice was silenced, her spirit had not been extinguished. And in that thought they found solace, though they dared not speak it too loudly in a court where such words might be seen as treason. Beyond the court, the people of England adjusted to their new queen, though not without unease. Jane Seymour was crowned with honor, her modesty praised, her silence lauded as a virtue. Yet the memory of Anne clung like a shadow. She had risen so high and fallen so swiftly that her story became a caution, a whisper on the lips of women and men alike. Mothers warned their daughters of ambition, priests thundered of lust and pride, poets and chroniclers recorded her as both seductress and victim. And through all this, Elizabeth grew, unaware of the ways her very existence carried the weight of her mother's memory. Cromwell, triumphant for the moment, stood secure, his plot accomplished, his rivals destroyed. Yet even he must have known that shadows linger. For though Anne's body was gone, her image was not so easily erased. In foreign courts her story was told and retold. The king who had broken with Rome for love, the queen who had lost her head when love turned sour. Some pitied her, others scorned her, but all remembered her, and thus her name continued, carried not by monuments but by whispers. Elizabeth, small and silent in her cradle, was the truest monument of all. Though she did not yet speak, her very being testified that Anne had lived, had loved, had borne a child of Tudor blood. No decree of illegitimacy could change that. In her veins the inheritance of both Henry and Anne flowed, and in time that inheritance would shape the fate of England. But in these years that destiny was hidden, veiled in uncertainty. Elizabeth's path was fragile, her position precarious, dependent upon the whims of her father, upon the fates of new queens and new heirs. At times she was cherished, at times neglected, always a pawn in the restless game of succession. Her very presence at court reminded Henry of the wife he had condemned. And perhaps in this we see why his affection for her waxed and waned. He could not deny her blood, yet he could not forget the shadow of Anne's fall. Anne herself, though silent in death, seemed to haunt the court, not as ghost or specter, but as memory. The halls where she had laughed, the gardens where she had walked, the chambers where she had quarreled with Henry, these places held her absence like a wound. Those who had known her could not pass them without thought, without hearing in their minds her quick words, her bright laughter, her sharp retorts. For a woman who had lived so vividly cannot be so easily erased. In the kingdom beyond, the people too remembered. Some cursed her name still, calling her a witch, a usurper, a woman whose pride had torn apart the church. Others, quietly, began to see her as a figure wronged, a victim of men's ambition and envy. Neither view was wholly true, yet both carried fragments of the woman she had been, and in those fragments she remained alive in the imagination of England. Thus the hush after her death gave way to whispers, to stories, to a slow weaving of legend around her name. Elizabeth, still a child, could not yet know that she would one day embody that legend, that her reign would be seen as her mother's vindication. For now she played in her chamber, her laughter echoing against the stone walls, her tiny hands reaching for toys, her eyes bright with the unclouded innocence of childhood. And in that image we find the thread that carries us onward, a child at play, unknowing of the weight of history upon her, while outside the bells ring for another queen, and the shadows of the past linger still in every corner of the court. Elizabeth at play in her chamber, unknowing of the weight that pressed unseen upon her, was a tender image. Yet beyond that room the echo of her mother's fall spread through the court like a warning bell. Queenship itself had been altered, its meaning reshaped by Anne's fate. For never before in England had a crowned queen been tried and executed, her head severed as though she were a traitor rather than a consort. The ladies of the court, who once had looked to Anne with admiration or envy, now whispered among themselves in fear, wondering how secure any crown could be when even queens were not spared the axe. If Anne Boleyn could be so swiftly raised and so swiftly struck down, what hope had others who walked the same perilous path? The women who served Jane Seymour moved more quietly, more carefully than they had in Catherine's or Anne's day. They spoke with modesty. They kept their eyes lowered, for they had seen what too much wit or boldness might invite. Anne had shown that a woman's tongue, quick and sharp, could win a king's heart, but also lose it. And her fall taught all who watched that charm could curdle into threat in the eyes of power. Queenship, once a role of reverence, now bore the shadow of danger. To be wife to Henry was not only to share his crown, but to stand forever upon a narrow ledge, the void yawning on every side. The men of the court also drew their lessons. Cromwell, triumphant in his orchestration of Anne's downfall, grew more formidable, but also more feared. If he could weave such a net around a queen, what chance had lesser courtiers? They bowed deeper, spoke with greater caution, and weighed their alliances with sharper care. Loyalty to the king was absolute, but even loyalty to the king's chosen wife could not guarantee safety, for wives themselves might fall from grace. Henry's will had become the only true security, and even that was fickle. And beyond the court, the people of England lived with unease. They had seen their queen crowned with splendor, only to see her head struck from her shoulders a few short years later. They had seen the church torn from Rome for her sake, only to see her condemned as sinner and traitor. They had watched their king defy the world for her love, only to cast her aside with merciless speed. Such contradictions left the people uncertain, their loyalties shaken, their faith in kingship itself clouded. If a queen could be so utterly undone, what stability could there be in throne or altar? In foreign courts, the lesson was equally clear. Ambassadors wrote home with astonishment, describing Henry's ruthlessness, his willingness to sacrifice even his queen when she no longer served his purpose. Kings and emperors, popes and princes looked upon England with a mixture of fear and disdain. To them, Henry seemed both powerful and dangerous, a ruler who bowed neither to church nor custom, whose heart could raise a woman to a throne, and whose anger could cast her down to the scaffold. The name of Anne Boleyn was spoken in whispers across Europe, her story woven into the cautionary tales of courts far from England's shores. Yet for all these warnings, Anne's memory endured in subtler ways. She had changed the very shape of power in England. By her marriage, the break with Rome had been sealed. By her fall, the precariousness of queenship had been laid bare. And though her enemies sought to erase her, her image lingered. In Elizabeth's face, in the quiet recollections of those who had known her, in the murmured stories of common folk who could not forget the queen who had lost her head. Perhaps, too, her story haunted Henry himself. Though he married Jane Seymour with haste, though he sought to bury the past, there must have been moments when Anne's laughter or her anger returned to him in memory, unbidden. In the stillness of night did he recall the letters he had written, the vows he had sworn, the crown he had placed upon her head? Did he hear again her voice declaring her innocence before her judges, her last words of prayer upon the scaffold? We cannot know. Yet even kings are not free from memory, and Anne's shadow must have lingered in Henry's mind long after her body was laid in the chapel earth. In the chambers of the court, meanwhile, young Elizabeth continued to grow, watched by her attendants, her life at once sheltered and precarious. She knew nothing yet of her mother's fate, yet every glance upon her face reminded others of Anne. Some whispered that the child carried her mother's quick intelligence, her mother's fiery spirit. If so, it was a dangerous inheritance in a world where such qualities had led one queen to ruin. And yet, in time, it would be Elizabeth's very strength, her wit, her will, that would raise her higher than any Tudor before her. The hush that followed Anne's death had become a murmur of lessons, a shifting of conduct, a new caution among women and men alike. The court moved forward as it always did, Yet beneath its glitter, the memory of the scaffold lay heavy, shaping every smile, every silence, every careful word. And in this way, Anne's story did not end with her death, but continued to shape the lives of those who came after her. Her fall, a warning, her legacy a question that none could yet answer. The image that carries us onward is of Elizabeth once more, playing still, her laughter bright against the somberness of the world around her. For while others whispered of caution and peril, she alone was untouched by fear, and in her unknowing joy lay the seed of a future that would outshine the sorrow of the past. Elizabeth's laughter rang out in her chamber, clear and bright, carrying an innocence untouched by the shadows that clung to her lineage. And yet outside those walls, her mother's story grew larger with each passing year, not as a memory alone, but as a legend, a warning, a shadow that seemed to fall across all who came after her. For Anne's life, brief and blazing, had altered not only the present, but the imagination of the court, and every queen who followed her walked beneath the outline of her fall. Jane Seymour, who had risen in Anne's place, must have felt it keenly. Though she was loved by Henry for her gentleness, though she gave him the son he longed for, she lived under the silent lesson of Anne's fate. Her conduct was measured, her words careful, her obedience perfect. Perhaps she believed humility would guard her where boldness had doomed her predecessor. Yet even she did not escape sorrow. For within little more than a year she was dead in childbed, the infant prince in his cradle, and the queen laid in her grave. The crown, it seemed, was a perilous gift, and Anne's shadow whispered that it could not be held without cost. Cromwell, too, may have felt that shadow. He had engineered Anne's downfall, weaving the net that caught her, and for a time he prospered. Yet when he arranged Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a union the king found intolerable, his fortunes crumbled. The same king who had allowed Anne Boleyn's blood to fall upon the straw now allowed Cromwell's, the minister undone by his own ambition. Thus Anne's fall set a precedent. No one was beyond the reach of Henry's will, not queen, not counselor, not even the hand that had once done the king's bidding. And so the years passed, queens rising and falling like figures upon a stage, each one stepping into a role shaped by Anne's fate. Catherine Howard, young and lively, bore the same family blood as Anne and shared also her ruin, accused of sin and brought to the same Tower scaffold. Catherine Parr, wise and careful, survived Henry only by tempering her wit with caution, her learning with obedience. Each of them lived beneath the memory of the queen who had first shown how swiftly favor could turn to death, and in that sense, Anne never truly left the court. Among the people, her story grew stranger, embroidered with superstition and rumor. Some said she had bewitched the king, using sorcery to enthrall him. Others swore that at her execution, a dog had licked her blood from the straw, an omen of her guilt. Still others whispered that she had been a martyr to reform, dying for the faith that would one day flourish under her daughter. In taverns and cottages, her name was spoken with awe, sometimes with scorn, always with fascination, for she had been both sinner and saint in the eyes of those who judged her, and no verdict could silence her completely. Elizabeth, meanwhile, grew into girlhood with this legacy surrounding her like an invisible cloak. She was clever, quick of mind, fond of books and music, her tutors impressed by her grasp of languages and her sharp questions. In her, those who remembered Anne saw the same fire, the same brilliance, the same intensity that had once captivated Henry. Yet her position remained uncertain, her legitimacy questioned, her future insecure. She could not yet know that she would one day sit upon the throne and turn her mother's disgrace into triumph. But perhaps even as a child she felt the stirrings of destiny. For some children carry within them an awareness of their place in the world long before it is spoken aloud. Henry himself could not wholly escape the memory of Anne. He rarely spoke her name, and yet she was never entirely gone from his life. When Elizabeth smiled or spoke with sharpness, when courtiers whispered of the past, when foreign rulers recalled his defiance of Rome, Anne's presence returned like a ghost that would not be dismissed. In his later years, swollen with age and burdened by regret, perhaps he looked back upon the days of his youth, upon the passion that had driven him to remake his kingdom for her sake, and wondered if the sword had ended her or himself. Anne's shadow stretched further still, beyond Henry, beyond the Tudors, into the very fabric of England's story. For her life had bound love and power, faith and ambition, in a knot that could never be untied. She had shown that a woman, though bound by custom, could alter the course of nations. She had shown also that such power came at a cost too great to bear alone. Her name became a tale told in caution and in awe, and each telling carried a different truth. Thus the laughter of Elizabeth, still bright in her chamber, was not only the joy of a child but the faint beginning of Anne's vindication. Though the world had condemned her mother, though the axe had silenced her voice, Anne's legacy lived on in her daughter's breath, in her daughter's play, in her daughter's future. And in that laughter lay a promise, faint but unbroken, that the shadow would one day give way to light. The image that leads us onward is of that shadow itself, long and lingering, stretched across the years, falling upon queens and courtiers alike, yet unable to dim the brightness of the child who carried within her the flame of the woman who had lost her head. The shadow stretched long across the years, falling not only upon the queens who followed Anne, but even beyond Henry's own life. And when at last the king lay in his grave in 1547, that shadow did not fade, it deepened, for memory is not buried as swiftly as flesh. In the quiet after Henry's death, Anne's story stirred once more, now reshaped by the shifting fortunes of her daughter. Elizabeth was still a child then, watching as the throne passed first to her young half-brother Edward, son of Jane Seymour. In those years, she lived more in the margins than in the light, her place in succession recognized yet precarious, her legitimacy always questioned, her mother's fate spoken of in low voices. Still, she learned, and with every book she studied, every tongue she mastered, every lesson in music or scripture, she carried forward the spirit of the woman whose blood she bore. Anne's enemies had sought to erase her, but they had not foreseen that the daughter who once toddled in silence would grow to embody her mother's legacy more powerfully than the Queen herself had done. The court of Edward was steeped in Protestant reform, and here, perhaps, Anne's spirit found its first vindication. For she had been accused of heresy, of sowing the seeds of religious dissent, and now those seeds began to sprout openly under Edward's reign. Though Elizabeth was still young, she must have felt some secret pride, or at least a silent recognition, that the ideas her mother had favored were now shaping the kingdom. Yet her position remained uncertain, for politics at court was ever shifting, and the shadow of Anne was not always a comfort. To some, Elizabeth was a dangerous reminder of her mother's defiance. To others, she was the promise of a future not yet secure. When Mary came to the throne, the shadow darkened. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, remembered well the sorrow her mother had endured, remembered too the humiliation inflicted by Anne. For Mary, the very name Boleyn was poison, and Elizabeth, though half-sister, carried that taint in her blood. In Mary's reign, Elizabeth was watched closely, at times imprisoned, her life threatened by suspicion and the memory of her mother's rise. It must have seemed then that Anne's legacy would doom her daughter as surely as it had destroyed herself. Elizabeth walked carefully, spoke cautiously, lived in the shadow of danger, yet within her the flame of her mother's spirit did not go out. And then, when Mary died and Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, that flame blazed forth. Suddenly, the child once declared illegitimate, The girl once dismissed as her mother's shame now sat upon the throne of England, crowned and anointed with all the splendor once denied Anne. In Elizabeth's coronation, Anne was present, not in body but in spirit, for her daughter's triumph was her vindication. The people cheered, the bells rang, the streets filled with music and color, and though none dared say it openly, all knew that the shadow of Anne had shifted at last. What had been scandal became legend. What had been disgrace became triumph. Elizabeth ruled long, and under her reign, England flourished. The arts blossomed, the seas were conquered, the realm grew strong. In her intelligence, her wit, her sharpness of tongue, her refusal to bow to any man, Elizabeth seemed the true daughter of Anne Boleyn. She wore no crown of a husband's giving, she bore no child to secure her throne, but she ruled with a power and majesty that silenced all who once doubted her. And in her reign, the memory of Anne was transformed. No longer merely the queen who lost her head, she became the mother of Gloriana, the root of an age that would be remembered with pride. Thus Anne's shadow, once dark and heavy, became a shape of light. Her enemies had tried to reduce her to scandal, but her daughter raised her to legend. The crown that had been a burden upon Anne's brow became in Elizabeth's hands a symbol of triumph, and the hush that had followed Anne's execution gave way to the music of an age that bore her spirit forward. The image that carries us onward is of that coronation in 1559, Elizabeth crowned in Westminster, the people shouting their joy, and behind her, unseen yet present, the figure of Anne Boleyn, her eyes dark and watchful, her lips curved in the faintest of smiles, as if at last the silence had given way to justice. Elizabeth's coronation shone with golden light, the bells of Westminster pealing in joy, the streets crowded with faces uplifted in hope, and behind her, in the silent procession of memory, walked the shadow of Anne Boleyn, no longer merely the condemned queen, but now the mother of England's new sovereign. In that moment, the hush that had followed her execution decades before seemed to break open, giving way to a new voice. For with Elizabeth enthroned, Anne's story began to change, woven not only by whispers of scandal, but by the brighter threads of myth. In Elizabeth's court, where poets, scholars, and courtiers gathered, Anne was remembered with new reverence, though often cloaked in careful words. Some recalled her as the noble mother of the Queen, a woman whose wit and learning had prepared the way for the glory of the present age. Others spoke of her devotion to reform, her support of Scripture in English, her courage in facing death with dignity. Even those who had once scorned her name now softened their tone, for to insult Anne was to cast a shadow upon Elizabeth, and none dared to risk the Queen's displeasure. Slowly, the tale of Anne Boleyn shifted. The temptress became the martyr. The usurper became the forerunner of an age. Poets found in her story a theme of tragedy that stirred the heart. They compared her to figures of ancient lore, women who had risen high only to be cast down by fate, whose deaths gave birth to new worlds. Chroniclers, writing under Elizabeth's gaze, softened the harsh judgments of earlier accounts, casting Anne not as witch, but as victim, not as sinner, but as mother of greatness. In taverns and marketplaces, her story was retold with embellishment. Some said her ghost walked the tower, carrying her head in her hands. Others claimed her spirit watched over Elizabeth, guarding her throne. Legends grew around her, and though they were shaped by imagination more than fact, they gave her a strange immortality. For no one could speak of Elizabeth without recalling Anne. For Elizabeth herself, Anne's memory was both burden and strength. She rarely spoke her mother's name, perhaps out of caution, perhaps out of pain, for the scandal of Anne's fall was never fully erased. Yet she wore a small ring, said to contain a portrait of her parents, hidden close against her skin, as though carrying with her always the silent witness of the mother she had lost too soon. In her refusal to marry, in her command of her own destiny, in her sharpness of mind and tongue, Elizabeth seemed to echo Anne, to claim for herself the power her mother had grasped but been denied. Where Anne had been broken, Elizabeth endured, and in her endurance, her mother's honor was slowly restored. The people, too, began to see Anne differently as the decades passed. They looked upon Elizabeth's reign, the peace she maintained, the victories won at sea, the flourishing of learning and art, and they could not help but trace it back to Anne. Without Anne, there would have been no Elizabeth, and without Elizabeth, no golden age. Thus the scandal became foundation, the tragedy became triumph. Those who once had cursed Anne now found themselves blessing the daughter, and through the daughter, honoring the mother. Foreign rulers who had once mocked Henry's passion and Anne's rise now watched England with respect and envy. They saw a queen who ruled with strength unmatched, and they understood that her birth, though once questioned, had become the source of England's pride. Anne's story, once a tale of folly, now gleamed as part of a larger design, and even her enemies could not deny that from her had sprung a greatness that could not be ignored. Yet beneath the myth, the woman herself remained elusive. Those who had known her were gone, their voices preserved only in fragments, in letters, in hostile chronicles, in sympathetic whispers. Anne was remembered now more as symbol than as self, her true nature obscured by the weight of what she had come to represent. Was she saint or sinner, victim or schemer, martyr or fool? The Elizabethan age answered not with certainty but with poetry, shaping her into whatever form best served the needs of memory. Still, within the tower walls, the stones remembered. The chapel where she lay remained quiet, the earth above her grave unmarked by monument, while beyond its walls her daughter's court blazed with glory. Visitors to the tower would sometimes pause at that humble place, reflecting on the strange path by which England's fortune had been shaped. A queen buried in silence, her daughter reigning in splendor. In that contrast lay the mystery of Anne's legacy, a story that could never be told in simple lines, but only in echoes and questions. Thus Anne's shadow, once heavy with shame, became a presence more complex, half light and half dark, a figure both feared and revered. And in this transformation we see how history itself works, reshaping memory as years pass, softening what was once sharp, brightening what was once dim, until the truth lies hidden beneath layers of retelling. The image that carries us onward is of Anne's grave within the Tower Chapel, unmarked and quiet, while outside the world speaks her name in legend. A contrast of silence and sound, of stone and story. A reminder that though her body lies in earth, her memory walks the halls of time, forever bound to the reign of the daughter who bore her flame into the future. The grave within the Tower Chapel lay quiet, the stone floor above it worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, the air dim with the hush of candles and prayers, and in that silence Anne Boleyn rested, her name carried not upon marble or brass, but upon the voices of those who remembered. Outside the chapel walls, her daughter ruled with majesty. The world spoke of her with awe, and yet within that narrow place there was no sign to mark Anne's presence. It was as if her body had been consigned to forgetfulness, while her memory walked unbound through history, reshaped again and again by those who told her story. In Elizabeth's reign, Anne's spirit seemed to linger like a quiet presence behind the throne, never named aloud, yet never absent. Courtiers who bowed to Elizabeth could not help but recall the mother whose life had ended upon a scaffold, and poets who praised the Virgin Queen found themselves circling back, in whispers or in metaphor, to the queen who had given her birth. The silence of the grave and the brightness of the crown intertwined, for Anne's death had been tragedy, but her daughter's reign was triumph, and together they formed a story that stirred the imagination of England and beyond. As the years passed, Anne's tale was told in many voices. Some made her a saint of reform, a woman who died because she dared to support the cause of Scripture and the freedom of the English Church. Others painted her still as a temptress, a woman whose pride and ambition brought ruin to herself and to those around her. In both portrayals, she was larger than life, more symbol than woman, and the truth of her, her laughter, her fears, her tenderness, her human contradictions, slipped away beneath the weight of legend. Yet perhaps this, too, is a kind of immortality, for to be remembered in many ways is to be remembered always. In time, even after Elizabeth was gone and other rulers sat upon the throne, Anne's name remained. The people of later centuries, looking back upon the tumult of Henry's reign, saw in her the turning point, the figure whose presence had broken the order of the world. Without her, the break with Rome might not have come as it did. Without her, Elizabeth would never have ruled. Without her, the shape of England itself might have been altogether different. Thus Anne, once condemned as traitor, became in memory a maker of history. And yet, what of the woman herself? Beneath all the retellings, we may still glimpse her, the girl at Hever, sharp-eyed and quick, walking among the meadows, the young lady in France, graceful and observant, learning the arts of courtly life, the courtier who caught the king's gaze, who dared to say no when others yielded, the queen crowned in splendor, radiant and proud, the mother who cradled her infant Elizabeth with fierce devotion, the prisoner who walked to the scaffold with steady step, her voice clear, her prayer unbroken. In these glimpses, fleeting yet vivid, she is not only symbol but soul, a human life lived in fullness, flawed and bright, undone yet enduring. What lessons, then, does her story leave us? That ambition can raise us high, but envy and fate can bring us low. That power is both gift and danger, offering glory but demanding sacrifice. That love itself, when bound to crowns and kingdoms, can become a weapon sharper than any blade, and perhaps also that the measure of a life is not in how it ends, but in what remains after, in the echoes carried forward through children, through memory, through the shape of history itself. Anne's life was scandalous, tragic, brilliant, brief. She was admired and despised, exalted and condemned, crowned and executed. Yet in the end she was also remembered, and in that remembrance she triumphed in ways her enemies could never have foreseen. For though her body lies silent in the Tower Chapel, her name is still spoken, her story still told, her presence still felt whenever the tale of England is recalled. And so we close this long telling where we began, within the Tower walls on a May morning. The crowd gathers, the drum beats, the Queen walks forth, her face pale yet serene, her words steady. The sword flashes, the silence falls, yet beyond that silence, her daughter rises, her legend grows, her memory endures. Anne Boleyn, the queen who lost her head, gained instead a place in the timeless story of humankind, a place where tragedy and triumph meet, where scandal becomes myth, and where a woman's life, though brief, becomes eternal. The final image we leave is of the tower itself, its stones gray against the evening sky, the ravens circling as they have always done, the chapel quiet within, and the wind carrying faint whispers across the Thames. In those whispers her name is still heard, not with bitterness now, but with wonder, as part of the endless story of those who lived, who loved, who fell, and who are remembered.